Daedalus here. I'm known for anything at all. It's for military history and analysis. So, with everything going on with Iran and the United States and Israel, I figured I should make this video. It's going to be a long one. We're going to cover a lot of topics, but follow along and there's going to be rich rewards, mostly of knowledge and sarcasm. On the morning of 7 December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched over 350 carrier-based planes in two waves against the American forces based out of Oahu in a sneak attack. The battleships of America's Pacific Fleet and their attendant escorts were attacked in the naval anchorage at Pearl Harbor, while Army and Navy air forces across the island were simultaneously struck. Oahu was the forward operating base of America's fighting power in the Pacific, and the attack on the morning of the 7th was intended to neutralize this force. Simultaneously, Japan launched a massive series of attacks throughout the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, and the Dutch East Indies. The objective was to seize vital resources, particularly the oil and rubber of the Dutch East Indies, and create a defensive perimeter to protect these gains. The American forces on Oahu were judged the most salient threat to this effort, and so were targeted preemptively. See, at this point, depending on one's reckoning, the Second World War was already in its fourth year. Japan had spent the better part of the previous 4 decades steadily occupying other peoples such as the Koreans and doing horrible things to them. Eventually, their control had expanded into Manchuria and northern China. Japanese forces then invaded China proper in 1937 after a staged incident in which a Japanese soldier got lost in Wanping, and Japanese soldiers then attacked the Chinese troops, demanding entry to search for him. This pretext sparked a horrific invasion, with news of Japanese barbarity, and it was absolutely barbaric, shocking the world, and drawing condemnation and, most importantly, oil sanctions from the United States. The Japanese military and economy depended on imported American oil, and being cut off from it placed Japan's war effort on a clock. They refused to suffer the embarrassment of losing their great empire because America had docked their oil allowance, leading us logically to this moment and the attack on Oahu. Meanwhile, in Europe and North and Central Africa, Germany and Italy had spent the better part of the early 30s tearing up the post-World War I continental order in order to bring their nations to prominence among Europe's imperial powers. Italy launched a brutal invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Under Mussolini and their exciting new brand of nationalist assholery, fascism, Italy was looking to make good on its ambitions from the First World War. Not to be outdone, the rulers of Germany's fragile Weimar Republic decided the installation of the far-right Nazi party leader Adolf Hitler was a better idea than communism, an arguable proposition at best. Hitler, in addition to being a decorated soldier, failed painter, and best-selling author, was the single greatest sanitation engineer in German history. Upon his ascension to the chancellorship, he promptly disposed of democracy, the more irritating parts of his own party, and anything the Marquis de Sade would have found fun. And that's all without mentioning the multiple groups of people his regime eventually tried to dispose of, including but not limited to Jews, the Roma, anyone Eastern European, but particularly Poles and Ukrainians. At any rate, by December 7th, Germany had overrun Poland, Holland, Belgium, France, Denmark, and Norway. Additionally, the Germans had bailed out Italy after a stalled invasion of Greece, and both countries were fighting the British in North Africa in a seesaw of a campaign. France had been turned into a rump state. London and southern England were being brutally bombarded by the Luftwaffe. German forces, meanwhile, had invaded the USSR and driven the Red Army before them. The Wehrmacht had won massive encirclement battles at places like Kiev and Minsk, destroying massive Red Army formations. Even as Japanese ships steamed towards Hawaii, the Germans had engaged the Soviets outside of Moscow. All this by way of saying the situation looked pretty bleak for the home team on 8 December 1941. Now, you might be wondering why I just spent so much effort on this little summary of the first parts of the Second World War in a video about the Iranian War. If you're clever, you're going to get what I'm driving at. But first, I want to talk to you about some particulars and some foundation, and then we'll get to Iran, I promise. Actually, we're going to lay quite a lot of foundation. Figuring out who won a war is a more complex thing than simply tallying wins and losses. Traditionally, victory in war was seen as subduing the other country, marching into their capital and securing a treaty. Now, it never really was this simple, but this is the 19th century paradigm. It's why the Union, for example, spent so much time and energy trying to take Richmond in the Civil War, and conversely, why they fortified Washington, D.C. Japanese commanders understood that victory did not entail Japanese troops taking Washington, D.C. Indeed, they could not realistically invade at any point during the war. Instead, they intended to win by creating a strategic calculation in which their capture of the resources of the Dutch East Indies was accepted by the United States without a long, drawn-out war. The theory being that, taken on the whole, with what resources America had available after Pearl Harbor, taking back the territory Japan had seized would be considered too difficult, and the United States would sue for peace. It is, to my mind, a perfect example of how the geostrategic situation shaped Japan's military strategy, which in turn defined their operational and tactical choices. Put another way, sometimes victory is about reframing your conflict. This is pertinent for talking about this recent conflict. As of the time of writing and recording, this dust has not really settled. However, Israel's continued occupation of Lebanon seems to be threatening Trump's attempt to totally capitulate to Iran's demands to end the war. This, as an aside, is easily one of the most ridiculous sentences I have ever written that is mostly true. However, for the moment, it's fair to say that the strategic initiative seems to rest squarely with the Islamic regime. One of the things I have noticed in recent military conflicts is what I'll call the opening of the Twitter front. Again and again, you see propagandists, some paid by their governments, and some being enthusiastic amateurs who attempt to paint a narrative on various social media sites of overwhelming success for their given side. These are efforts at swaying public opinion and breaking or strengthening national wills. It is the digital weapon to surpass Metal Gear that was prophesied by Hideo Kojima back in 2001. These efforts create a lot of noise and obscure details, making unraveling the tactical situation in the moment difficult. Even as the fighting, with some notable exceptions, winds down, the Twitter front becomes a continuation of the war by political means. In order to understand what has happened, we need to cut through this by getting back to the basics and talking about key military thinkers like Jomini and Clausewitz. Additionally, we need to talk about the ancient art of winning by denying the enemy the battle they seek. Antoine-Henri Jomini is the most influential military thinker that most people have never heard of. He served in both the French and Russian armies during the Napoleonic Wars. Allegiance for officers in those conflicts being a somewhat complex thing that could shift as political winds shifted. He then settled down after the war and wrote a book, translated roughly as The Art of War. It isn't terribly long, but it is compact and assumes the reader is fairly well conversant with European military history. The book was not formally introduced as a textbook to West Point in its entirety until its 1862 translation, but elements of it were being used as the bedrock of instruction for military officers in the United States for most of our early history. We're going to get into Clausewitz in a hot second, but his ideas didn't really catch on until after Prussia's stunning victory over France in the War of 1870. And even then, only after Chief of the Prussian General Staff Helmuth von Moltke the Elder was asked the key to his success. He replied that he kept Clausewitz's book on war on his nightstand. I'd make fun of him for this, except that I went to get my copy of The Art of War off my own nightstand to reference while writing the script. To make Jomini short and digestible, his view of war was scientific. The center of an enemy's power is identified. Then the obstacles, namely enemy forces, to controlling or destroying that center of power are further identified. Then, he directs you to bring overwhelming combat power to bear upon those obstacles, outflanking them and destroying them, rendering these forces unable to defend that center of power, after which you will compel the surrender of your enemy. This is simple, and how war tends to be understood in the popular imagination. It is the quintessential Napoleonic paradigm. easy to digest and easy to imagine, and it is a much beloved paradigm of the propaganda warriors of the Twitter front. It is also repeatable, hence the science moniker. Given this description, it should come as no surprise that Jomini views the ending of wars in similar, almost rigid terms. Quote, "War is always to be conducted according to the great principles of the art. Great discretion must be exercised in the nature of the operations to be undertaken, which should depend upon the circumstances of the case. Put another way, war should be waged according to doctrine, but with a mind towards the objectives of that war." Jomini's understanding of war could be seen in how the conflict with Iran was talked about a lot in social media commentary circles. The human cost was set aside, and instead the focus was volume of target hits, outgoing Iranian drone and ballistic missile fire, warships sunk, what platforms were flying over what Iranian airspace. All these were presented as indicators of tactical successes. A drop in outgoing missiles was seen as proof of the successes of airstrikes. Videos of silhouettes of exploding planes were seen as proof of Israeli and American air domination. Claims of plotting B-1 Lancers and B-52 Stratofortresses flying safely across Iranian airspace was touted as proof that we had them on the ropes, overwhelmed and utterly outgunned. News of the sinking of Iranian frigates and corvettes was greeted as a triumph. Iran touted its own strikes as evidence that it was giving as good as it got. Volleys of cheap Shahad drones and ballistic missiles were launched at nations hosting American forces in Israel. Videos of drones hitting targets throughout the Gulf were released by Iran. Israel complained bitterly on social media about Iranian missiles falling on their cities without a hint of irony, and Iran, in a display of rhetorical self-control that can only be described as legendary, refrained from pointing out how many Israeli military installations are in civilian centers. The discourse was virtually purely tactical, and it didn't focus on the hypocrisy of the United States and Israel or the brutality of all parties involved towards the civilians caught in the middle. Looking purely at the war through Jomini's framework, we lack the tools to understand what happened next. In order to grasp this, we need a holistic view of warfare as an element of national policy and will. This view must be informed by the writer's philosophical education and influences. We need to look at Karl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz was born in Prussia in 1780 to a family with questionable ties to Prussian nobility. Like many young boys born into Prussia's canton system, Clausewitz entered the military at an inappropriately young age, 12 in this case, and then made it his life. He attended Prussia's military academy from 1801. Later, having loathed Napoleon, he happily served in any army currently fighting France's megalomaniacal emperor. This led him to fight first for the Prussian army, then the Russian army during Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And ultimately, he returned to Prussian service once Napoleon had finally been vanquished. As for what Clausewitz studied, it isn't entirely known, but it is presumed that some Hegel and Kant were as included, as Clausewitz seems very fond of Hegel's dialectical process and Kant's distinct style. Clausewitz eventually wrote his ideas down in a slightly hefty tome called On War. The work is organized into 8 books covering various topics, including, quite helpfully in the first one, an examination of what war is. The process Clausewitz goes through is a dialectical one, advancing definitions of war, then exploring those before refining those definitions in an attempt to encompass the totality of the phenomena of warfare, until we get to paragraph 24 of chapter 1. This is the most famous line, and the one that everyone argues about. We see, therefore, that war is not merely a political act, but also a real political instrument, a continuation of political commerce, a carrying out of the same by other means. The end of the paragraph hits quite similarly to the earlier quote from Jomini, but however powerfully this may react on political views in particular cases, still it must always be regarded as only a modification of them. For the political view is the object, war is the means, and the means must always include the object in our conception. The text has some build-up prior to this, describing war first as a simple national wrestling match, and then as an endeavor where the only aim is the total destruction of the enemy. Then Clausewitz, notable for being an early woke soy vegan hippie, points out that the total destruction of enemies involves doing unspeakable evil and could be regarded by others as a monstrous crime, and that we should probably not do that. So he settles on war need to be constrained by the presumptive moderating force of a sovereign state's policies in order to be a war and not merely barbarity with kick-ass tailoring. This framing does an important thing. It gives us a conceptual out to the tyranny of Jomini's view, where Jomini sees war, and by extension victory, as being delivered by decisively defeating the military of an opposing nation. Clausewitz provides a framework where war is a tool that advances the interests of the nation. In Clausewitz's view, it can very well be that the nation's interests can be advanced and the war won by the destruction of the opposing military, but this does not need be the case. And the kicker is, none of this is new. In fact, this idea is considered a certified classic. Let's talk about the Punic Wars for a hot sec. This is the last history bit, I promise, then we'll get to the main point. The two great powers of the classical Mediterranean world were the Roman Republic, who claimed a very dubious mythical lineage going back to Troy, and the Carthaginian Republic, who could claim a very legitimate lineage to the Phoenicians. The first great clash between these two powers was called the First Punic War, fought primarily on and in the seas around Sicily from 264 BCE to 241 BCE. The Carthaginians, owing to their Phoenician heritage, were masters of the water, while the Romans were much more effective on land and got their teeth kicked in during early naval battles. The Romans sat and considered this problem and decided that there was only one solution. They clearly needed to find a way to turn naval battles into land battles. As an aside, in fairness, everyone who played Total War Rome 2 on release had this problem. So, they decided to build giant floating platforms with a huge hook called the corvus to smash down on the deck of their ship. Then they filled those with legionnaires and smashed them into Carthaginian warships. The Carthaginian crews found them quite surprised by the sudden reversal of fortunes, and Carthage gave the whole thing up as a bad job and started nursing a hell of a grudge. That grudge was made manifest in 219 BCE when the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca picked a fight with Rome, attacking the Roman allied city of Saguntum located in present-day Spain. Before Rome had finished processing this outrage, Hannibal led his army, including a contingent of African war elephants, through Gaul and over the Alps, much to the presumed consternation of the elephants, and a not insignificant portion of his army which died on the march, and to the complete surprise of the Romans. The Romans, being Roman, did what they always did, and debated the issue in the Senate. Then, they appointed two of their numbered consul, one who wished to rush off and fight Hannibal, and another to restrain the first. They alternated command of the army so that one consul commanded it on one day and the other consul commanded it the next. Having recognized the flaw, Hannibal pioneered the tactic of children of divorce everywhere. That is, he simply waited to get what he wanted until the more malleable parent had custody. Hannibal would wait till the aggressive consul was in command of the Roman army, provoke that consul into a disadvantageous battle, win, and then convince Rome's local allies to give him supplies because he was a winner and Rome was weak. This approach won Hannibal two famous victories, one at the River Trebia in 218 BC and a second at Lake Trasmene in 217 BC. Fortunately, Rome had a constitutional fix for when their constitution led them into a crisis. They threw out the constitution and appointed a dictator. Typically, this was a capable military commander, as the crises were almost always military. This commander was handed a term limit and absolute power to address whatever Rome found troublesome. The principal example of this is Marcus Furius Camillus, who was made the dictator when Rome was sacked by Brennus and his Gauls, and the survivors were besieged in the Capitoline Hill. In the case of Hannibal, the Romans chose Quintus Fabius Maximus, Fabian to his friends. It's possible that this was his second go at the job of dictator. Nevertheless, he assessed the situation and made several astute observations. First, he noted that fighting Hannibal in open battle sucked. Second, he observed that Hannibal really wanted to kill as many Romans as possible. And third, he noticed that Hannibal had some very insecure supply lines. And so Fabian settled on a strategy of going, "Look, your shoe is untied." And once Hannibal looked, Fabian would poke him in the kidney and run away. Instead of facing Hannibal's army directly, he would attack their supplies and allies, trying to outlast Hannibal's capacity to maintain his campaign. He he attacked the logistical capacity of Hannibal's army in order to outlast him. This approach to war, although politically unpopular in Rome, became irrevocably associated with Fabian. For example, after being beaten at Long Island and Brandywine Creek, George Washington adopted it to defeat the British in America's War for Independence. The idea is simple: deny the enemy an outright military victory and outlast them until the overall situation is favorable to you. This finally brings us to the present kerfluffle. There are, more or less, 4 major groups involved. The first is the United States of America. Founded in 1776 by a group of wealthy landowners who decided they would like to charge each other tariffs instead of being charged tariffs by the English crown, the United States has been the center of financial, cultural, and military power since the end of the Second World War in 1945. Additionally, they have been an unmatched global hegemony since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Situated basically in the middle of North America between the similarly large nations of Canada and Mexico, the United States and Americans occupy a particular social niche in global affairs and the imagination of the world at large. As an American, I can attest to my own personal list of complaints, chief among them being a horrible system of paying for healthcare costs that would be comical if it wasn't stupid. Other than that, an objective view of American history reveals some considerable room for improvement in many areas concerning human rights. But in my view, these issues are not fundamentally unworkable. The second party is Israel. Hold on to your butts, because I'm about to piss off everyone. Israel is a series of farm fields on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea that is between everywhere else important in the Middle East. That would have been the end of it, except the region ended up being the spiritually vital center of approximately 4.4 billion people worldwide. Formally established in 1948, Israel is the result of the long-term efforts of various Jewish diaspora communities to displace their Arab cousins living in historic Palestine in order to establish an ethno-state. Much like other examples of such efforts in nations like South Africa and Rhodesia, this has resulted in a bloody and unnecessary conflict which could have been more readily and justly resolved by having the parties work together. Israel touts itself as a major ally of the United States on the grounds that it shares the values of freedom and democracy. While this assertion is widely mocked by military thinkers, it is a beloved trope of American politicians, who can count on a considerable amount of financial support for blindly parroting this idea, no matter how patently ridiculous it is from a strategic point of view. Depending on one's reckoning, Israel has the largest population of Jewish individuals in the world, followed closely by the United States. American fundamentalist Christians view Israel as a kind of pet they are required to keep around in order to fulfill their eschatological fantasies. My impression from conversations is that both American and Israeli Jews alike view this as little more than a weird and highly anti-Semitic quirk. But in the case of Israeli Jews, so long as it remains an ocean and a half away and they can continue to leverage these loonies to their benefit, then it isn't worth getting too upset over. Israel's war for independence, popularly cast by them as an existential fight for the survival of the Jewish people in a post-Holocaust world, can more accurately be understood as a territory dispute. Upon declaring independence after a proposed UN partition plan was rejected by the nascent Palestinians, a group of nations calling themselves the Arab League declared war on Israel. Aggressive statements aside, the Arab League was unable to determine who was going to get what territory and got bored and wandered off. For their part, the Palestinians had already basically been defeated by this point, having been ruthlessly militarily and politically suppressed by the British prior. With the exception of a handful of areas, such as Jerusalem, the Palestinians were rendered military irrelevant to their own war before the Arab League had even finished putting on their proverbial shoes. This particular conflict has not since really been settled and flares up in new and terrible ways. Our current conflict with Iran can be viewed through the lens of Israeli and Iranian efforts to maintain regional hegemony. This brings us to Iran. This is historic Persia, the traditional enemy of Athens and Sparta and then of Rome. It's a slightly exotic stop on the Silk Road, perhaps best known for cataphracts, early dualist religions, and as of late, fundamentalist Shia clerics. Let's skip a couple millennia, seeing as the runtime on this is getting up there. Iran has been considered a hostile nation to the United States since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Its It's an ethnically diverse nation basically smack in the middle of Western Asia, and it's also a theocratic dictatorship built into the side of a series of mountain ranges. In January of this year, things were not looking great for the Islamic regime. Generations of mismanagement of the water systems, combined with a 5-year drought, had caused mass displacement and dissatisfaction in the nation. These factors, along with the general understanding of not being free, had sparked protests across the country, to which regime forces responded by brutally slaughtering a large number of protesters. The exact number is, as of yet, a subject of considerable contention, with official Iranian accounts suggesting somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,100 deaths, while other groups posit numbers as high as 20,000. For the moment, it should be sufficient to say that while we don't have a solid understanding of the scope of the crackdown, we can acknowledge that it was horrific. Iran has been the subject of extensive sanctions since recently, but generally they suffer from a constrained economy even without factoring in the sanctions. Iran cannot afford a large conventional military, at least not one capable of standing up to Israel and the United States. Instead, they build their offensive striking power on 2 pillars. The first is a network of groups throughout the Middle East, including, but not limited to, a truly bewildering network of militias operating in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza, and to a lesser extent the West Bank. The second pillar is a network of launch sites dug into mountains that act as a fortress for a huge variety of ballistic missiles and drones. Digging tunnels has long been one of the most prudent and cost-effective methods of fortification, and Iran looked around at its mountains and said, "This'll do." Traditionally, American and Israeli propaganda has portrayed Iran's clerics as lunatics hell-bent on obtaining a nuclear weapon so that they might usher in the end times by nuking Israel. In this fantasy, they've been a jiffy away from doing so for the past 3 decades now. It's pretty clear that only the most dedicated or foolish anti-Iranian propagandists believe this, as one might argue it unwise to constantly provoke the supposedly insane clerics by bombing them. Yet we have basically made it a hobby in the wake of October 7th. The final important note is that Iran is situated along the waterways of the Persian Gulf, and specifically the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's crude oil is shipped. This vital waterway is one of the most important economic water routes in the world. Iran tried to shut it down during the Iran-Iraq War, leading to the so-called Tanker War. The United States ultimately sank much of Iran's navy in the culmination of the Tanker War in order to maintain freedom of navigation. The United States has traditionally worked to maintain freedom of navigation to further its global hegemony rather than out of any sense of altruism. Nevertheless, these patrols help keep prices stable for most of the world's population, particularly around the industries that require the use of fuel. The final party to this conflict is a collection of bystanders, which are in some way connected to the American military. As an aside, NATO was involved in the defense of the British half of Cyprus, which Iran had targeted and NATO defended, but overall this was fairly minor in the grand scheme of things. In addition to Israel, Iran or its allies targeted Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. All of these nations host, to some degree, America's regional military presence under the umbrella of the Central Major Command. The reason for their hosting of American military forces is varied and complex, but it basically boils down to a calculation made in the wake of the Gulf War of 1991. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. In order to finance their military, in part, they sought loans from neighboring Kuwait. In 1988, that war ended, and soon after the loans were to start to come due. The Iran-Iraq War had not gone well for Iraq, and Saddam Hussein suggested to Kuwait that they might forgive those loans. Kuwait scoffed and demanded that Iraq pay it up. Iraq, having a cash flow problem, suddenly found themselves in a pickle until they remembered that the money that they had been loaned had been used to purchase guns. The solution naturally presented itself, and Iraq invaded Kuwait. This freaked the hell out of Saudi Arabia, who prevailed upon the United States to lead a coalition of nations to expel the Iraqis from Kuwait. After a brutal air campaign, ground forces swept through Kuwait, crushing the remnants of Iraq's army and driving it back over to their side of the border. This was named first Operation Desert Shield and then the mildly cringe-inducing Operation Desert Storm, a name which would be topped in cringe by the present conflict's name of Operation Epic Fury. In the wake of this success, and coupled with the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States enjoyed unprecedented popularity throughout the Middle East, which we wasted absolutely no time squandering. At any rate, as a hedge, first against Iraq, then after 2003 Iran, the aforementioned states have generally regarded hosting U.S. military bases as a minor inconvenience in exchange for security. Iran has pretty much ruined that illusion. In an effort to stretch limited Allied defensive weapon systems, particularly interceptor surface-to-air missiles, beyond capacity, Iran attacked American bases in these countries and facilities and civilian installations in those countries directly. This drew these nations into a conflict about which they were not consulted before Israel and America kicked it off, and of which they did not express a desire to participate in. All in all, what was once considered a minor inconvenience became something of a major one. All that being said, we can arrive at my point. I promised we'd get here. This won't be a blow-by-blow of strike and counter-strikes. Plenty of channels think they can do that. If you want to watch an excellent, fastidious, independent news effort, I highly recommend we check in with friend of the channel, Nick Suter. He's been out here doing the Lord's work of being an excellent news reporter for the rapid-fire chaos of Trump's second term. How's it going, Nick? Hang in there, buddy. Israel observed Iran's difficulties and protests at the start of the year and saw the regime at possibly its weakest point ever. Seeing their rival on the verge of collapse, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met secretly with key members of America's current presidential administration, led by Donald Trump. In these meetings, the Israelis convinced Trump and Defense Secretary and local drunk Pete Hegseth to join Israel for what has now become the annual running of the bombers to Tehran. News reports suggest that Israel framed this as a one last push to topple the regime. Netanyahu has been taking advantage of Israel's constitution, which allows for the creation of a war cabinet during times of war in order to combat his staggering unpopularity due to being ridiculously corrupt, which was already out of hand before and not at all helped by October 7th. So it is likely that starting a war with Iran neatly married his personal goal of retaining power and staying out of prison while expanding Israel's regional power. I suspect that the Israelis didn't quite believe the line they sold Trump, but hoped that once Trump was committed, that he would judge the political cost of being seen to lose to Iran as being higher than the cost of being seen to kowtow to Israeli interests above American ones. Largely, this seems to have been proven very correct by this point. On 28 February, Israel and the United States launched a massive surprise attack on Iran. Ostensibly, this was during negotiations mediated by Qatar, in which it was rumored that Iran had made major concessions. Trump held a press conference in which he invoked the slain protesters and declared the goal being the destruction of and the regime change of the Islamic regime. He would later furiously deny this. Each nation employed the vast panoply of aircraft and precision-guided munitions at their disposal. Each and every PJM fired by CENTCOM causing a tear to be shed by planners in PACCOM. Video clips of silhouettes of Iranian jets and choppers exploding were posted by Israeli and American propaganda accounts, accompanied by fanciful declarations that this explosion brought us all one step closer to total victory. Warships were sunk. The Allied Twitter front was exulting in the carnage. Iran wasted no time in retaliating. They fired ballistic missiles and their new wonder weapon, the Shahed loitering munition, a cheap drone with long range and a dangerous payload. These were fired from concealed launchers in mountain ridabouts. Wave after wave issued forth, making a cruel mockery of the Twitter front users who, the year before, claimed that Israel had dealt a mortal blow to Iran's missile program in the 12-day war. Iran targeted Israel and any nation with an American base. In response, their air defense radars powered on and scanned the sky for missiles and drones. Fighters would be vectored or surface-to-air missiles launched in order to counter the incoming threats. Most Iranian attacks were stopped cold, although some got through to devastating effect. Iran's own Twitter front struck up their chorus, claiming they were savaging the attackers in a noble defense. They claimed they would sink America's carriers. Probably hyperbole, but we did move them further out to sea in order to give our defensive screens more time to react to incoming threats. In response, Israeli and American forces loudly switched to targeting suspected Iranian launch sites and infrastructure. A clock was started. We only have so many interceptors, and the global need is massive, with nations like Ukraine arguably needing them more, seeing as Ukraine didn't start their war. Additionally, these cost millions apiece, and the operation of the launch systems, from training the operators to building and maintaining the equipment, cost millions more. PGMs like the famed Tomahawk land attack missile are similarly expensive, rare, and difficult and lengthy to produce. Every weapon fired in an offensive or defensive capacity is a second ticking down that can cost someone else somewhere in the world their life. If we could destroy the launch sites before the clock ran down, Iran's gambit would fail. It appeared to the Twitter front to be working. Iranian launches slowed. Likely, there was some success at targeting the shafts dug into the mountains or launch sites that were not constructed in the mountain runabouts. However, a second problem emerges. The Iranian people seem incredibly uninterested in overthrowing their oppressors, while the forecast calls for American-made bombs. This leads into the third problem. While Netanyahu has pretty much made the Knesset and courts a non-factor in Israel, their civilians are too busy ducking and covering in bomb shelters to object in overwhelming numbers to this, Donald Trump does have a problem. He is staggeringly unpopular. His party, the Republicans, are unpopular, and Israel, widely regarded as who we were fighting on behalf of, is breaking records with how unpopular they have become with the American public. Historically speaking, military planners must know that a ground invasion of Iran would be bitterly resisted. Iran turned their cities into death traps when Iraq invaded in the 80s, forcing them to suffer horrific casualties to secure ground. Then Iran would launch crushing counterattacks while the Iraqi forces were too weak to consolidate their gains. While the United States has a large and modern military, it isn't large enough to conquer Iran. In order to do so, I estimate that at the bare minimum, the army would have to be tripled in size. While we pride ourselves on an all-voluntary military, there is simply not enough volunteers available to do this. To try to do so would require a draft. The draft in Vietnam, for example, was pretty small in comparison to the Second World War, but unlike the Second World War, it was highly unpopular. Very, very unpopular. Given the combined lack of popularity of Trump, the Republicans, the war, and Israel, I suspect that Trump, Hesketh, and Rubio rejected this idea outright. All told, the American effort was starting to look untenable. Then Iran dropped their hammer blow. Perhaps taking inspiration from the Ukrainians having driven the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol and back to its Russian anchorages, mostly using drones. Iran deployed drones, missiles, and bog hammers to threaten traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. Prior to the war, around 20 million barrels of oil a day would pass through the strait, but by May that had dropped to less than half. It wasn't that Iran was hitting ships all that often, but rather the threat of them doing so, coupled with the fact that America had observed and indeed assisted Ukraine in driving the Russian Black Sea Fleet back, and they had judged the risk of deploying warships to the strait, under constant and near instant threat from Iran, to be too great. The Air Force and the Army gave it the old college try, deploying A-10s and A-60 H-64 Apaches to hunt down bog hammers, and Iran responded to this by giggling and said maybe we mined the strait, maybe we didn't. This naturally caused Lloyd's of London's entire actuary department to have an aneurysm. Since Trump's inauguration in 2025, the cost of living has been rising in the United States. The disruption to 20% of the world's crude oil supply was immediately felt at the gas pump. You'll probably again see a sharp increase in the cost of food, which is already ridiculous, by August or September as a result of these supply disruptions. Trump, realizing that it was up shit creek and that Netanyahu had absconded with the paddles, began hemming and hawing over what the war is even supposed to achieve anyway. He then declared that the US Navy was blockading the strait, perhaps in an attempt to confuse Iran by pretending to switch sides. War may be the continuation of policy by other means, but Trump was unable to articulate what that policy even was. This left the war somewhat bereft of a clear goal and set against the pair of strategic dilemmas that Iran had dropped in Trump's lap. Lacking this direction, and with a Jomini-style victory politically and militarily impossible, Trump gave the whole thing up as a bad job by 17 June and started looking for a way out. So, postscript, Daedalus here. Didn't really get to recording this when I wrote it because life and some medical stuff got in the way. So I wrote this at the end of June originally, and I didn't get to finish recording till roughly the end of July. And in that time, a ceasefire was negotiated, which then collapsed due to primarily Israeli intransigence over Lebanon and repeated violations by both sides. So at this moment that I'm recording the rest of this, the war is effectively back on, but still militarily and politically unviable for Trump to achieve any kind of meaningful victory. And it's largely unclear what direction this is going in, except that it alarms me deeply for everyone involved. I don't feel that I can adequately address where this is going to go because it's not being handled rationally by Trump at all. So with that in mind, bear in mind this is a little drop in, and let's just finish the essay. Netanyahu suddenly realized that while he may have had the paddles, Trump had stolen his watch. Iran, recognizing that they pretty much had just did the military equivalent of the 1980s Miracle on Ice, decided that lifting of the sanctions and charging tolls to transit the Strait of Hormuz were an excellent door prize. Additionally, they sought an Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, which Trump apparently agreed to without consulting Netanyahu. All of this brings us to the end of June, where after Israel attacked Hezbollah in Lebanon again, Iran has once again declared the strait closed until Trump apologizes, reins in Israel, and releases pallets of cash to Iran. Seeing as the strategic and political calculation hasn't changed, Iran pretty much has got Trump by the short and curlies. This is how Iran has won this war. They have not won a decisive victory against American and Israeli forces on the battlefield. But what they have done is survived. They've retained their striking power and their ability to project power into the Strait of Hormuz as a regional force. This, coupled with their ability to rapidly repair their mountain fortresses and their infrastructure when it's struck, has given them the ability to survive and outlast the United States' attacks. It's the Fabian strategy, perfectly executed. In the end, they have studied their opponents well and understood what they needed to do to win, and that wasn't going to be fighting openly in the field. It was going to be by outlasting and outliving their enemies. Thank you for your time in watching this essay. If you enjoyed this or found it valuable, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and like. It really helps out the channel. If you disagree, go ahead and leave a comment. I might read it. And if you want to support this channel financially, you can either give a donation as a super thanks or go to our Patreon, link in the description. Again, thank you,